Hi, everybody. Today we are going to be focusing on cardiovascular system, looking at your heart anatomy and physiology, as well as some of the anatomical features of your blood vessels. So let's go ahead and get started by looking at your cardiovascular system as a whole. So the main two type of organs you can find in your cardiovascular systems are your heart, which is basically your pump, and your blood vessels, which includes your arteries, your veins, and your capillary networks that basically are responsible for transporting your blood to basically every corner of your body. Now, what is the function of your cardiovascular system? Cardiovascular system has your pump, which is basically through the action of contraction, creates enough pressure to circulate your blood throughout your blood vessels. Creating that blood pressure is extremely essential, as if the heart fails to produce the proper pressure, it is possible that parts of your body will not receive enough oxygenated blood or circulation of blood, and therefore that causes tissue damage or death. You also have the blood vessels, which are again responsible for transport. So think about them as basically the pipelines of your body. It takes the blood to wherever it needs to go, and then collects the blood from the tissue and return it back to your heart, or or take it to your lungs. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Another main function associated with cardiovascular system, which also associates with your respiratory system, is the gas exchange. Gas exchange implies either exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen between your blood and your tissue, or exchange of the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, between your blood and your lungs. And again, if that is not clear right now, it is okay. As we go through this, it becomes really clear the difference between the gas exchanges that happens within the body, between the blood and tissue, and the gas exchange that happens between your blood and your lungs. So let's start by looking at the anatomical characteristic of your heart in terms of its location. So heart is identified as a double pump, which is located at the center of your thorax or your chest cavity. And this is responsible basically for creating enough pressure that moves blood through your blood vessels. The heart is not this pretty shape that you see drawn in like kind of Valentine's Day. It is actually a cone-shaped organ, which you can see right here. It sits slightly on an angle, and it sits on top of your diaphragm, which is basically this dome-shaped muscle located underneath your lungs and your heart. It is protected by this central bone that we already know as a sternum, or your breastbone. And it is also partially protected by your rib cage. Now, your heart has this kind of pointy edge to it that is always pointing to the left, and that is known as the apex of the heart. And you have the top of your heart where all the blood vessels either enter or exit your heart, and that region is known as the base. Please be careful. A lot of us have this kind of preset motion that every time you think about base, it's always at the bottom. So in this case, your base is actually on the top and the apex is at the bottom. Now, let's go ahead and again, kind of dive into a little bit more about your heart. So when you look at your heart is made up of 3 layers. And then you also have layers that are around your heart in terms of protection. Now, for our purpose, I am only going to be focusing on the layers of the heart. But if you look at the picture, you may actually see names that may be familiar to you, but those are basically the layers that are going to be surrounding the heart and play a role in protection. So make sure you guys make that distinction. So the 3 layers of the heart are endocardium, myocardium, and epicardium. Now break down the words for yourself again. Endo means inside, myo means muscle, epi means on top of. The word cardium implies associated with your heart. So endocardium is the inner layer that is basically lines the cavity of the heart. It's the inner lining of the heart. It lines the chambers of the heart. Then you have this really thick layer, which is basically your cardiac muscle, and that is known as your myocardium. So when you think about your heart, we're telling you that the heart is a pump, and the way it can create pressure is by contracting its muscle. Therefore, your heart needs a significant amount of muscle layer to be able to create enough contractile force to push the blood out of your heart. The outermost layer of the heart itself is referred to as the epicardium. Epicardium is the layer that is basically the outer layer of the heart, and it is also part of the layer that surrounds the heart. So I'm going to be very careful with this. The epicardium is basically part of a double layer that surrounds the heart, but it's also part of the heart itself. So if I ask you, write the layers of the heart from the outermost layer to the innermost layer, your answer would be epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. If I ask you what is the thickest layer of the heart, then your answer must be myocardium. Now, before we dive into this whole structure and looking at the blood vessels and looking at the chambers of the heart, etc., I want you guys to establish a key component of understanding how your heart works. Now, for that, we're looking at this whole color coding scheme that is going to be held true to every anatomy textbook you're going to review. Now, it'll be a medical textbook versus a really introductory course. So all of them will be held to this color coding of red and blue. So the red color will be associated with the blood that is carrying a significant amount of oxygen and has a low level of carbon dioxide. In another sense, it's referred to as oxygenated blood. So if you guys remember, when your hemoglobin is carrying oxygen, it's called oxyhemoglobin. It had that ruby red color. Hence, we associate the red color with oxygenated blood. Sometimes I may refer to it as the quote-unquote good blood. There's nothing called good blood, but it is good in terms of the fact that it has significant amount of oxygen. Now, when your heart has dropped off its oxygen, it has lost its oxygen and therefore is referred to as deoxygenated blood. Now, deoxygenated blood also has a high level of carbon dioxide. So you're literally reversing the concentration of gases when you compare oxygenated versus deoxygenated. Oxygenated blood is high in O2 and low in CO2. Deoxygenated blood is high in CO2 and low in O2. Therefore, sometimes I refer to this as quote-unquote bad blood. Again, nothing bad about it. It just simply means it has a lot of the waste gas CO2. Now, if you recall again, when you have separated the oxygen from the hemoglobin, the color of that is dark red, which under our skin appear as a blue color, and therefore we associate blue color with deoxygenated blood. You don't have a blue blood, it's the same blood, but again, for the simplicity of our purpose, anytime you see the blue, it means deoxygenated blood. Now, your heart has separated the parts that carry oxygenated blood from the parts of the heart that carries deoxygenated blood. The structure that separates these two types of blood, and again, I put the word type in quote, they're not necessarily two different types, it's just the amount of the gases in them, using a muscular layer or separation called a septum. So here is a key point, guys. The right side of the heart is always going to carry deoxygenated blood. So your right side is always depicted in blue color. And the left side of the heart is always going to carry oxygenated blood and therefore is going to have the red color associated with it. So when you do color coding of your heart, always recall the red is associated with oxygenated on the left hand side, and blue is blue color, sorry, deoxygenated blood is blue color and associated with the right side. And the separation between these two colors is a muscular layer called the septum. So let's take a look at this. Again, I haven't really talked about any of the terminology right now. All I want you guys to know is here is my right side, anatomical position, right? So it's the right side, the mirror image, the right side, the left side. Right side is in blue color, left side is in red, and the separation between these two is referred to as the septum. So let's go ahead and dive in now into the 4 main chambers that makes your heart a very strong pump. So in your heart, regardless of if you're comparing the right side or looking at the right side versus the left side of the heart, you have 2 chambers on the top and you have 2 chambers on the bottom. So doesn't matter right or left, you have a chamber on the top, you have a chamber on the bottom. The 2 top chambers of the heart in a plural sense are called atria. And if we're talking about one individual one, they're called atrium. And the 2 bottom chambers are referred to as ventricles or ventricle, if I'm talking about one of them. By looking at this picture, we already identified these 4 chambers. So I'm gonna just kind of go over them with you. So right here, this structure you have, this area right here is your right atrium. This is your left atrium. And this larger chamber on the bottom is your right ventricle. And this chamber right here would be your left ventricle. The separation between the right and left is your septum, which is, again, you can see it's a muscular layer. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at what is the function associated with atria versus the function associated with your ventricles. So atria, which are the 2 top chambers of the heart, are identified as the receiving chambers of the heart. So what does that mean? When blood wants to come and get introduced into the heart, doesn't matter if it's deoxygenated or oxygenated, the first point of entry back into the heart will be your atria. So the 2 atria, again, your right atrium and the left atrium, are both going to receive blood. Now, to kind of getting into a little bit more detail, this atrium, which is your right atrium, is receiving deoxygenated blood because it's on the right-hand side. The left atrium is going to receive oxygenated blood, or that red color blood, because it's on the left-hand side. The ventricle that you see right here, it's your right ventricle again. This one is your left ventricle. So what is the difference between the two? Right ventricle is going to receive blood from the right atrium. So if I change this to my little pen to kind of highlight the process. So you have basically blood coming into your right atrium and then come down to your right ventricle. And the same concept applies on the left-hand side. Blood comes into the left atrium and then comes down through the force of gravity to the left ventricle. So when the blood is in your ventricles, it doesn't matter again, right or left, this chamber is literally going to contract, and it allows it to create what we identify as the pumping action that pushes the blood out of your heart. So if I ask you, what is the main difference between the atria and the ventricle? Atria's job is to receive blood. Ventricle job is to pump blood out of your heart. So that's the main function. Now, the blood that enters both atria, again, move down to the ventricle as we depicted. And then from ventricles, blood gets pumped out of the heart using what we identify as the muscle contraction. Again, heart is a very strong pump that creates a lot of contractile force using its myocardium. Now, for us to understand how blood actually circulates through our body and our heart, we need to be familiar with the blood vessels of your heart or your body in general. So we already kind of got some terminology in earlier, but I'm going to introduce the words again and associate a specific function to them. So I mentioned the three main categories of the blood vessels are arteries, veins, and capillary networks or capillaries. So arteries, if you call something an artery, you're identifying blood vessels that are taking blood away from the heart. So I always tell myself A for away. So arteries are always moving blood away from the heart. We are not looking at if the blood is red or blue. We're looking at the direction of the blood, guys. Moving away makes that an artery. Now, there are two main arteries associated with your heart. The main one is associated with the left ventricle, which basically pumping blood out of the heart or away from the heart. That's known as the aorta. And we have one main branch coming off of your right ventricle called the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary implies your lungs. So basically it implies that pulmonary trunk is going to take the blood away from your right ventricle. Again, here's the word, away from your right ventricle, and take that blood to your lungs. Now, arteries are these really kind of large blood vessels we have. Again, main ones being your aorta and your pulmonary trunk. But I cannot have these just really large blood vessels supplying the whole body. So what I need to do is make a smaller and smaller branches of these blood vessels so they can basically distribute the blood to every corner. So the smaller branching of the arteries are referred to as arterioles, which basically means little arteries. These are smaller in diameter, which kind of makes sense. They do have a smooth muscle in the walls, which basically means they can contract or relax them. When they contract, that causes the blood vessels to constrict, and basically their diameter becomes small. And when these smooth muscle relax, it causes the blood vessels to dilate or open up. These are essential in terms of controlling your blood pressure. Now, as the arterioles continue, then you form really, really tiny branches, and I mean really tiny branches called capillaries. Capillaries are really small blood vessels, and they're literally made up of single layer of epithelium. More specifically, if you're looking at this and you recall your information, these are simple squamous epithelium, which basically means single layers of flattened cells. Why is capillaries so important for us? Capillaries are going to be the site for what? Exchange of my gases. So exchange of gases basically again implies that you're either picking up or dropping off oxygen or picking up or dropping off carbon dioxide. So regardless of what type of capillary we're talking about, there is the location for the gas exchange. You can see these arrows kind of allowing things to leave the capillaries, but these arrows can simply also be moving in as the direction, as the movement can be bidirectional. Now, veins and venules. So veins are basically opposite of arteries in terms of function. If arteries took blood away from the heart, veins are, their job is going to be returning blood back to the heart. Now, veins are these really large blood vessels. So you basically need to form a smaller branches and then join those smaller branches to form your veins. So the smaller branches of your veins are called venules. And again, these are going to drain your capillary network. And they are similar in a structure to arterioles. I'm sorry, it says arteries, but they're similar to arterioles. they just have less smooth muscle. And these venules, they eventually empty into your veins, which are the largest of the blood vessels that return blood back to the heart. Now, because your heart is now going to receive blood, right? Receiving is associated with the atrium, right? The two chop chambers of the heart. So blood coming into is referred to as your the blood coming into your heart are associated with veins. If blood is coming on the right-hand side of the heart, it comes through two main veins called superior and inferior vena cava. And if it's coming through your left side, it's coming through what we identify as pulmonary veins, which are coming into your left atrium. And again, I know it's a lot of information, but it's all going to come together in just a few minutes. So here is a depiction, guys. You have your artery to start with. Arteries form smaller branches called arterioles, which is this one. Arterioles form this network that you see right here called the capillary network. Capillary network is basically where you have the gas exchange. The blood then gets picked up by your venules, right? And venules get picked up by your veins and returned back to the heart. One of the main differences you can see is in terms of when you compare arteries and veins is the diameter, which basically allows the blood to pass through. So you can see the artery diameters are smaller and the veins are really large. The main way is that you really want to make sure that blood is coming back to the heart, so you make your veins really open so it can easily flow the blood back to your heart, as there is not significant pressure in these blood vessels. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty details of your heart. So blood vessels of the right side of the heart. Now, I want you guys to think about this before I go over the slide. So if you can glance away from your computer screen and let's try to remember the concepts we discussed. If I'm looking at the heart, we said that your heart has two sides. The right side is always going to carry deoxygenated blood, and the left-hand side is going to carry the oxygenated blood. The chambers that are sitting on the top are called the atria, or atrium, if you're talking about one. They're the ones that are going to bring the blood back to the heart. And the two bottom chambers are called ventricles, and these are the ones that are basically pumping blood away from the heart. So on the right-hand side of the heart, the blood vessels that are going to bring blood or deoxygenated blood back to the heart are superior and inferior vena cavas. So why do I have two veins that are returning blood to my right atrium? The reason is your heart sits in the middle of your chest, which means the blood that's being collected can come from the top part of your body, which is your arms, your neck, and your head, or the blood can come from the bottom of the heart, which is basically your abdominal cavity, your pelvic cavity, and your legs. So superior vena cava collects blood from the top portion, right, or above the heart, which is again your head, neck, and your arms. And inferior vena cava collects deoxygenated blood from the rest of your body, which is the abdomen and legs. Now, the blood goes from your right atrium down to the right ventricle, and that blood is, think about it, is deoxygenated, right? So where can I send blood to become oxygenated? Think about the question, guys. Where can I send the blood to go from deoxygenated to oxygenated? Your logical answer should be your heart. Sorry, your lungs, not your heart. Your lungs, right? What is the importance of your lungs? It allows for gas exchange to happen. So the blood that is on the right ventricle is going to go through a blood vessel called pulmonary trunk, which means it's associated with your lungs. And as it comes out of the heart, as the pulmonary trunk comes out of the heart, now it's gonna form two branches. Kind of like, why two branches? Kind of think about the heart. Your heart is surrounded by your two lungs, right? So blood that is basically coming out of the right side and you need to go to the lungs, you need to branch it. So one branch goes to the right lung and the other branch goes to the left lung. So you form two branches called right pulmonary artery and left pulmonary artery. So let's take a look at this. So again, I want you guys to really focus on these. These are essential for your understanding of the heart anatomy. So here is my right atrium. It's not labeled, but here is your right atrium. So first blood comes in, and actually let me just change the color to blue so you guys understand this is deoxygenated blood. So here is my right atrium. Here is my right ventricle. So blood comes from the superior vena cava and from my inferior vena cava into my right atrium. So this is basically gathering up here. Now, blood as it comes through the right atrium, gravity is gonna pull this blood down to where? To my right ventricle, right? And from the right ventricle, this blood is going to be pumped out through this big blood vessel right here, called the pulmonary trunk, and then branch to one branch, which is left side, correct? This is your left side. So that's your left pulmonary artery. And then this branch right here, which is your right pulmonary artery. If you're kind of wondering, wait, where is this connected? Imagine this, guys. If I do a dash line, this is the blood vessel right here. So it's the dash line, the blood vessel's right here. It goes behind here and then connects right here. So that's the actual path for the right pulmonary artery. It's not that's not connected to anything. You just don't see the path of it because it's hidden behind the other two blood vessels. So up to this point, we have understood that the blood on the right side of the heart is deoxygenated. It comes through the superior and inferior vena cava, empties into the right atrium. From the right atrium, it empties down to the right ventricle. And right ventricle is going to pump that blood through the pulmonary trunk and eventually through the right and left pulmonary arteries, which are destined for your lungs. Why am I sending this deoxygenated blood to my lungs? Because that is the location where my blood is going to drop off its carbon dioxide and pick up its oxygen. So that's where my transformation or gas exchange happens, where my blood goes from deoxygenated to oxygenated. Now, the left side of the heart we established is going to be oxygenated blood, right? So we're talking about a red color. So think about this. Left side needs to receive oxygenated blood. What just happened in my lungs is my lungs changed the blood from deoxygenated to oxygenated, right? So now that blood that is oxygenated needs to go back to the heart so it can get pumped. So how do I take the blood back to from the lungs back to the left side? I use 4 pulmonary veins. Break down the word for yourself, guys. Pulmonary means lungs, and veins means that it's returning back to your heart, right? Veins is collecting blood back toward the heart. So when we talk about 4 pulmonary veins, these are the 4 that comes from your lungs into your left atrium. So you have 2 main pulmonary veins on the left-hand side and 2 pulmonary veins on the right-hand side, basically from the right lung and your left lung. Now, blood comes into your left atrium and then slowly moves down, using the gravity, moves down to the left ventricle. What is the job of your ventricle? The job of your ventricle is to push or pump blood out of the side, out of your heart. So there is one big blood vessel that is associated with your left ventricle, and that is called the aorta. Aorta is going to carry oxygenated blood away from the heart because it's an artery. And this is beautiful oxygenated blood. Where can I send it? It needs to be going to your cells, to your tissues, to your body, so you can effectively provide your tissues and yourself with enough oxygen for basically survival. Now here's the thing, guys, let's connect these two together. Blood goes to your body, right? In your body, you pick up the oxygen and you give it carbon dioxide, right? You give your blood the carbon dioxide you don't want. So when the blood or the gas exchange in the tissue level happens, your blood goes from oxygenated to deoxygenated. So let's look at the blood vessels here in this picture. Now again, we're talking about the left side of the heart, so we're talking about oxygenated blood. So my color is now going to go back to red. So blood is coming from my lungs through these two blood vessels right here on the left-hand side, which is the left pulmonary veins. And these two right here, which is the right pulmonary vein. So again, kind of like, wait, these two are not coming over here. Seems like they're going to here. Again, if you look at the back of the heart, I can kind of track them like this. So they come in, imagine this is behind the heart, they go behind the heart and they empty into here. So they go here and then empty from the back into the left atrium. So from the left atrium, they go down to the left ventricle. Left ventricle is gonna pump the blood, so it kind of gives that circulation. It goes up and it goes behind here and it comes through this gigantic blood vessel, which is your aorta. So a couple of notes about this, guys. Aorta has this kind of a curvature. So up to this point right here, this part of the aorta is moving the blood up, right? So this part actually referred to as the ascending aorta. Then you have this curvature when these three main blood vessels come off of it. That's referred to as the aortic arch, kind of arch of the aorta or aortic arch. And then the blood vessel aorta starts to go down, right? So it starts to descend. And it goes behind the heart. So again, kind of imagine coming behind the heart and it pokes down right here. So even though this is still identified as aorta, the blood is moving downward. So it's actually, the full name would be descending aorta. So before we go into the valves, I really, really want you guys to put everything that I've described to you guys in one place. So I'm gonna do this kind of a screen for you, and hopefully this put everything in perspective for you. And if you can, after I'm done with the lecture and you feel comfortable with this information, you can recreate this on your own. That would be a really, really good idea. So here is, imagine this is my heart. Okay, and again, this is, actually, sorry, this is not the best drawing. So let me do this one more time, guys, sorry. So here is my heart at the center. And again, this is the cone shape we're discussing. Down here, I'm gonna say it's my cell or my tissue, which is basically one place for gas exchange. And let's say up here, I'm gonna draw these two structures which are going to depict my lungs. So you have your heart, you have your tissue, and you have your lungs. Yeah, I know it's a really simplified, but hopefully you'll still follow what I'm trying to do. So we're gonna start with the right side of the heart. So here is, the right side is gonna be again blue. So I have a top chamber, right? And then I have a bottom chamber. So this top chamber would be what? My right atrium, and this would be my right ventricle, correct? Now, two blood vessels are gonna come into my right atrium. These are coming from my tissue. One is coming from the top, the other one is coming from the bottom, right? So these are carrying deoxygenated blood from my tissue. So the one that is coming from the top is your superior vena cava, and the one on the bottom would be your inferior vena cava. So blood then comes down into your right ventricle. And this blood is meant to go to your lungs, right? Because this is deoxygenated blood, so it needs to go to the lungs to get oxygenated. So I'm gonna draw this big arrow that sends blood to your lungs, right? Now, what is this big arrow depict? Going to the lungs, the main branch would be first pulmonary trunk, right? And then pulmonary trunk branches to what? Right and left pulmonary arteries. Now, when we get to the lungs, what is exactly happening in my lungs is that I'm going to have a gas exchange, right? So the carbon dioxide is gonna come off and go to my lungs. So CO2 is gonna come off of my blood and go to my lungs. And at the same time, I'm gonna pick up oxygen from my lungs and drop it into my blood vessels, right? Or my capillaries. So that's the gas exchange. Your lungs is gonna take all of my CO2, which is my waste gas, and it's gonna give my blood a good oxygen. So when you do this gas exchange, now my blood goes from what? Deoxygenated blood to oxygenated blood, which means the color goes from that blue color to the red color. Now, before we do that, let's draw the left-hand side, the chambers, again, the top chambers and the bottom chamber. So you have your left atrium and your left ventricle. So blood comes from your lungs down into your left atrium. Anybody can tell, if you guys are looking at this, take a second. What is the name of the blood vessels that are coming here? They're called what? Pulmonary veins, because they're coming again from the lungs and they're going back toward the heart. How many do I have? You have a total of 4. 2 of them are the right-hand side, and then you have 2 from the left-hand side. Now, blood goes from the left atrium down to my left ventricle. And from the left ventricle, that blood gets pumped to my tissue using the largest blood vessel we have called the aorta. Now, what happens at my tissue level? Again, at the tissue, your tissue says, I want oxygen, I want oxygen. So your blood gives it its oxygen. So it drops off all the oxygen that it has picked up before. And the tissue says, I have a lot of waste gas, CO2. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you the CO2. So CO2 is now in your blood and oxygen has been dropped off in the tissue. So your blood goes from oxygenated blood to the deoxygenated blood. So by looking at this picture, we just complete 2 cycles, right? Pay attention to this, guys. One cycle is from the left side going to the tissue and going to the right-hand side. And the other one is the starting from the right-hand side, going to the lungs and come back to the left side of the heart. So they actually have a very particular name to them. If you think about this, and I'm gonna change the color so you guys can see this. If you're looking at the drawing that I have on the top, which is associated with your lungs, this circle on the top is referred to as the pulmonary circulation, which kind of makes sense, right? Because you're going to your lungs, you're exchanging gases with your lungs, so we call it pulmonary circulation. So I'm shorthanding it to PULM. This one is going to my cells and my tissues. So look at this word, guys. If you think about your organizational level way back at the beginning of last week, we had organizational level that start with chemical level, which went to cell, which went to tissue, which went to organ, and we went to organ systems. So when I'm supplying my cells and my tissue, in reality, I'm supplying my organs, which means I'm also supplying the systems of my body. So this bottom circulation, when you have the gas exchange at the tissue or cell level, is referred to as the systemic, as in systems of the body, circulation. So if I ask you guys, what are the two main type of circulation we have in our body? Your answer should be pulmonary and systemic. If I ask you, what is the word pulmonary circulation imply? It implies that you're taking deoxygenated blood from the right-hand side and sending it to the lungs to be oxygenated, and eventually returning it to the left side of the heart. The systemic circulation is associated with taking oxygenated blood from the left side of the heart, sending it to tissue for gas exchange, and returning the deoxygenated blood back to the right-hand side of the heart. So pay close attention to these words, guys. Make sure you understand the difference between the circulation. Make sure you understand the color coding. There's a lot of questions, and you have to have a really good grasp on this concept to be able to answer the questions. So the blue, the oxygenated, red, oxygenated, the separation from the left and right, etc. One last thing I want to talk before we close this part of the lecture is, if I take a look at the 4 chambers of the heart, all of them have the myocardium, which basically was the layer that is made up of muscle and gives me the capacity to push blood out of my, or push blood or contract or pump blood. Now, if you look at this and compare the atria to the ventricles, so the 2 top chambers versus the 2 bottom chambers, you notice that the atria barely have any myocardium versus your ventricles. So look at the layer, pretty thin. Look at these layers, pretty thick. Which makes sense because, again, the job of your atria is not to pump blood. Gravity does most of the jobs for it. Does it mean the atria does not pump blood? It does, but the pumping action to the ventricle is really minimal. Hence, you don't need much muscle to carry out the action. Now, you also see myocardium around the right ventricle versus the left ventricle. And notice, this is the main difference. The right ventricle has much less myocardium when it's compared to your left ventricle. So what is the reason here? I want you guys to think back about what I mentioned, the job of your right ventricle is versus the job of your left ventricle. Right ventricle sends blood to the lungs. Left ventricle sends blood to the rest of your body. So where are your lungs located? On either side of the heart. So do I need to create a significant contractile force to push blood basically just down the street, which is your lungs? And the answer is no. So I don't really need a lot of muscles around my right ventricle. But think about your left ventricle, guys. This part of your heart needs to pump blood to the rest of your body, right? Every part of your body, the head all the way to your toes, it needs to circulate that blood, which means it needs to create a significant contractile force, which means a lot of pressure. Therefore, your left ventricle is going to have the thickest myocardium to be able to create the stronger contractile force, so it can pump blood with the highest blood pressure, so every corner of your body can receive that oxygenated blood. So I'm going to stop this lecture now. We will pick up the lecture focusing on the valves of the heart, as well as looking at some of the physiological features of the heart, including muscle contraction of the heart.